Hello again, Zach here to talk about another Redwall book, specifically the second book in the series, Mossflower, though it is the third book chronologically. And to recap, Redwall books are stories of British woodland creatures, pretty much all mammals living in a vaguely medieval society. And because these books are all about basically the same thing, Brian Jacques kind of limited himself because he wanted to write book after book set in this universe. So how do the books all end up not being the same? Well, one of the criticisms of this series is that the books are kind of the same. When I read the books as a kid, I was kind of like, whatever, these are the books I read. But now as an adult, revisiting these series, trying to analyze them, I'm trying to think, what did Brian Jacques see in each book? What is supposed to stand out about each story? So the first Redwall book, I talked about how it's kind of a classic hero's journey. It centers around an ordinary mouse named Matthias who dreams of being a hero and works his way up to rise to that challenge. So how did Brian Jacques tell a different story, still about warrior mice, with his second book, Mossflower? Well, one of the important precedent-setting things with this book is that Brian Jacques did not write it about the same characters. This is a core feature of the series. You have a few characters who are in multiple books, but generally the books jump between generations. So this book, even though it's the second in the Redwall series, it's not about Matthias. In fact, it comes years before Matthias's time, when his inspiration, the legendary founding warrior of Redwall Abbey, Martin the Warrior, is around. And Martin's story in this book isn't really like Matthias. When we're introduced to him, he already has the resume of a warrior. So Mossflower is not going to be just another hero's journey. So what kind of story is it? Well, to start with a kind of negative, it's a more chaotic story. Because Mossflower is set before Redwall Abbey has been built, so the woodlanders don't have a big, peaceful place to live. Instead, what we have is the various woodland characters sort of huddled in the woods, hiding from the tyrannical cat ruler, Sarmina. And this lack of a peaceful home and lack of a sort of simple hero structure kind of forces Mossflower straight into the action. Whereas the first Redwall book features long scenes where its good characters are at peace and even its villains are kind of at peace, Mossflower, right from the start, is a dense array of battles between the good woodlanders of Mossflower and the evil vermin serving the cat rulers of Cotter Castle. And unfortunately, because Mossflower is just this account of permanent war, it feels at times like the characters have less personality than the characters did in the first Redwall book. One of Brian Jacques' strengths is that he seems to be able to keep track of an endless array of minor or semi-major characters. So in his first book, he managed to work in a really complex web of villains, each with their own motivations. So this book, Mossflower, it also consists of an array of villains. But this time, it just kind of feels like Jacques is sticking to that precedent. He's like, okay, I can't just have one villain. I have to have a fox villain and a weasel villain and some backups when they disappear. So for example, because the first book had a mystical fox healer, he's like, okay, well, that's a trope that has to be in my book. So he includes a fox conniving healer named Fortunata. But unlike Sella, the fox healer from the first book, Fortunata doesn't have that much of a personality. She's basically just one of the soldiers in the evil army. If Fortunata gets any real treatment, it's that she suffers what's probably one of the most brutal villain deaths in the whole series, when later Lady Amber and her whole army of squirrels goes full Quentin Tarantino on her. Another of the secondary villains is Ashleg. And I'm genuinely curious what Jacques' plan was for Ashleg, whether it changed a lot over the course of the writing. Because when Ashleg first appears, Jacques gives him this unique appearance. He wears a cape decorated with feathers, and he has a leg made of ash wood. He's also a pine marten, which is not a species that I think otherwise appears in the Redwall series. You have similar species, stoats, ferrets, weasels, but Ashleg is the one pine marten. So it feels like Brian Jacques is really paying some special attention to this character. But save for his very last scene, I mean, he doesn't really have a unique voice. He's just a sort of another generic villain.
Also, why include a kind of animal called a marten when your main character is a mouse named Martin? And even at some point in this book, there's a passing reference to the species of bird called martens. So a lot of unnecessary confusion here, Brian.
So now that I've talked about why I think Mossflower works less well as an engaging story than the first Redwall book, now I'm going to talk about what sets it apart, and in a good way. For one, Mossflower is this subtle Shakespearean thing going on. So its main villain is this dictatorial queen, Sarmina Green Eyes. One of the things that's really striking about Sarmina that sets her about as a character is in the second half of the book, she starts becoming paranoid, starts having all these delusions, kind of gives her a Lady Macbeth vibe. But I first actually started thinking of this book as Shakespearean in one of its powerful early scenes. So at the beginning of the book, Sarmina is not the absolute monarch of the Mossflower Woods. It's her father, the sickly king Verdauga Green Eyes. And Verdauga seeks advice from his two children, his son, Gingivier, and his daughter, Sarmina. Specifically, he asks for their advice on how to treat his prisoner, who is Martin the Warrior. Gingivier basically advocates for Martin to be set free, while Sarmina suggests he be killed. Verdauga expresses respect for both of his children and then compromises and basically calls for Martin to be imprisoned for a bit, but spared. While some may see this comparison as a stretch, the scene of an elderly, unwell king asking advice from his children, and one of his children displaying virtue and one of his children displaying selfishness and cruelty, it kind of reminds me of King Lear from his three daughters at the beginning of that play. And Verdauga Green Eyes, in terms of his own moral grayness, reminds me of King Lear, because King Lear is largely a good guy in the context of his own story, but he does sort of set themselves up for him because he's an arrogant king who just wants to be praised. Now, that's not King Verdauga's fault, but he is a similarly morally ambiguous figure. So on the one hand, to the woodland creatures, he's kind of a bad guy. You know, he conquered these woodlands. He established the dictatorship that Sarmina would come to be a far more brutal ruler in. On the other hand, he is markedly less brutal than Sarmina. And after Verdauga dies, his good son, Gingivier, is the one who actually misses him. Gingivier repeatedly mourns his father, while Sarmina doesn't really care. It makes sense that she doesn't care because she poisoned him. Verdauga is the kind of character who basically can't exist in Redwall, because Redwall is a series with a pretty strict good-evil binary. I find it interesting, however, that Jakes decided his good wildcat, Gingivier, and bad wildcat would be the offspring of this morally gray wildcat. Verdauga is this interesting origin story for these two characters, even if Verdauga himself is a character that's just incompatible with the moral logic of the Redwall universe. Verdauga, to me, represents the idea that sometimes the problem is not evil people, but evil systems. Verdauga, on an interpersonal level, is merciful, perhaps friendly. But in a sort of political, systemic level, he's committed to the logic of empire and of monarchy, systems that inherently cause violence and intense inequality and can empower true tyrants like his daughter Sarmina. So beyond finding Verdauga Green Eyes, this character who's largely not in the book, to be a fascinating character, I would argue that more broadly, Mossflower's unique theme compared to the first Redwall book is how much it skewers aristocracy. So one line that stood out to me in the book comes when Martin is in conversation with the motherly badger Bella. Bella has suggested that Martin seek out her father, the accomplished warrior Boar, who lives far away in the Salamandastron mountain fortress. Bella explains that both her father and grandfather left the family, hoping to go on this badger warrior's journey. She did not, however, get to go on such a pilgrimage because apparently only male badgers get to do this. Now, one might not find this line so shocking because Redwall is set in a medieval society. One might expect only the men get to be knights and the women stay at home. But that's largely not how the Redwall universe works. Redwall seems to be medieval except for gender roles where women are just as likely to be soldiers. And in fact, some of the most terrifying soldier characters, including Lady Amber in this book, are women, not to mention Sarmina, the arch-villain. So other than the possibility of Brian Jacques not thinking this through, what I take from this weird line about Bella not being able to go on a journey to Salamandastron because she's a female badger, to me it suggests that these badgers are a particularly traditionalist family or species, kind of like the royal family. They have to stick to all these traditions that the rest of animal society doesn't follow. And indeed, Bella kind of seems like an aristocrat. While all the other animals are hobbled in their little homes, sometimes I even get the sense they don't have houses, like the squirrels are just living in trees or the otters are just living in rivers. Bella has this big mansion called Brockhall, which is below a tree, and basically all the animals in the resistance are able to come and live at her mansion. So at the start of this book, Mossflower is kind of divided between these two powerful aristocratic families, the wildcats and the badgers. A key plot element of this book involves Martin the mouse warrior being told by Bella that maybe he can save Mossflower from the tyrannical wildcat if he convinces Boar the fighter, the great badger warrior, to come back from the Salamandastron mountain and save Mossflower. But what happens when Martin finally gets to Salamandastron and meets Boar and asks Boar, can you please come back and help your daughter or help this wood that you once came from? Well, Boar shows Martin a series of cave paintings that essentially predict the future. It's kind of weird since the Redwall universe mostly avoids magic. But at Salamandastron, everything is preordained, like the divine right of kings. It's this old-fashioned aristocratic place. In Boar's case, it leads to him not acting quite like a normal Redwall hero. Rather than responding to the call of the moment, coming back to save his daughter and his homeland, he basically just says, no, I'm a Salamandastron badger. I'm going to follow the prophecy on the mountains. And the prophecy on the mountain says, I'm going to go fight a sea rat instead of paying attention to what you're saying. And Boar, this sort of mystical aristocratic hero, stands in contrast to the characters who are actually the book's hero. So in addition to Martin, he travels with Gonth, a mouse who is kind of a Robin Hood style thief, and Dinny, a young mole who, like all the moles in the series, vaguely resembles the working class, in the sense that moles are construction workers, they dig tunnel. And for some reason, they speak with what I think is supposed to sound like a Cockney accent. So on page 257, for example, Dinny's speech reads, like as not, Martin, but he need digging claw like I to follow up at if when we and all to get out here. So as I was writing this, I think back to Ashleg. Remember him, that Pine Martin, where earlier I was complaining he's this villain who has all this aesthetic description, but then doesn't seem to have a unique personality? Well, now that I've had the time to sort of think through this theme of questioning aristocratic orders, I'm starting to see what Ashleg's purpose is. So I talked before about how Ashleg not only is this unique species, but he has this unique fancy cape, kind of like someone would wear at Queen's court. So anyway, spoiler alert, when Sarmina begins to go all Lady Macbeth, Ashleg removes his fancy cape and runs away to start a new life, seemingly quite possibly as a non-villainous character. Ashleg is the rare villain in a Brian Jacques novel who shows moral complexity. He redeems himself by giving up his symbol of royalist power. So Ashleg's transformation is not just about the transformation from evil to possibly good, but the transformation from royalty to ordinary civilian. And I'm convinced that that is sort of the theme that gives Mossflower a unique feel. It's a story where power at the beginning is limited to these powerful beasts, the wildcats and their Pine Marten vizier, and the badgers. There's also this eagle that dominates the forest for a little bit, though I think that's a weirdly written subplot. But what happens in the end is all the woodland creatures come together and, in the future, they will build this commune that is Redwall heavy. Aside from that, I always complain about my ideological difference with Brian Jacques, that as much as I like his books, he clearly writes them with a bit of a tough on crime attitude. Usually all of the bad guys get killed, and that's not really my thing. So I actually really appreciated with Mossflower that he was much more merciful to his bad characters. So he's merciful to Ashleg. There's another villainous commander named Brog who isn't given the most merciful treatment, but you can tell by the end, this character is thinking through why he ended up on the side he ended up on and starts to really feel vulnerable and sensitive. He's not just some brute of a warrior. And further to that, one of my critiques of the first Redwall book is how it felt like it kind of made a buffoon out of the pacifist character, Abbot Mortimer. This book has a few more strong pacifists in it. There's Abbess Germain, and there's Bella, this unique badger character in the series, in that she's not full of violence. You know, her soul benefited from the fact that her family's tradition meant she didn't journey to Salamandastron Mountain. And if anything, this book kind of reverses the part that I found kind of dumb in the first book, where the sort of more violent good characters make fun of the pacifist good characters, where it makes clear that the more violent good characters, Skipper the Otter and Lady Amber the Squirrel, they're a bit too gun happy and they get scolded for their immaturity and irresponsibility at one point. That said, the book I still think gets a bit too far into its tough on crime point, where there are all these villainous minions who are starting to realize, hey, wait a minute, why were we fighting for the queen? And the decision of the good characters is, okay, we're not going to kill you, but you have to give up your weapons. I agree with that. And you have to be banished. To me, that doesn't make sense. That's tough on crime stupidity. If you want to have a world where rats and ferrets and weasels and foxes aren't constantly attacking you, maybe integrate them into your society. Maybe show them that a world where they don't have to thrive by constantly attacking you is possible, rather than saying we cannot coexist. Because if your message is we cannot coexist, well, you know, eventually they're going to conclude, well, if I'm going to survive, I have to become a villain again. Overall, I think the opening context for Mossflower was a bit messier than the opening context for the first Redwall book. By, you know, jumping right into the action, it was a bit harder to become invested in individual characters. Martin isn't necessarily as well-defined a protagonist as Matthias was in the first book. At the same time, there's a lot interesting going on thematically here, and especially if one thinks of this book not actually as the story of Martin the Warrior, but of Bella the Badger, and of these changing power dynamics, where this badger from an aristocratic family structure comes to be part of an egalitarian, communal, multi-species family structure. I do find that kind of a compelling arc. So let me know what you think of Mossflower in the comments below, and I will see you with another video after I've read Matameo, or Matemio, however you pronounce that title, but the third book in the Redwall series.